It's like they fell off the face of the earth. They just disappeared.
When they told us they were found in a shallow grave in Oklahoma, we were devastated. It was a very difficult moment in time.
There are evil people out here in this world. He was able to manipulate the girls that he was in relationships with.
I was terrified. I hate saying this. It's so hard for me because I was just trying to survive. I couldn't come forward sooner. I wasn't safe. I'm gonna be honest, I'm still not safe.
There's no remorse. She's angry that she's caught.
I'm so sorry. This does not get easier, I promise. Time does not make this easier.
On Friday, January 4th, 2019, the Temple Police Department is alerted to the home of 32-year-old Michael Swearingen in Bell County, Texas.
That morning, the Temple Police Department received an alarm call at Michael's house. So patrol is dispatched out there. Crime was an abnormality in Michael's neighborhood. They hear the dog inside, and sometimes those alarms will be set off by a dog barking. So the alarm company will try to call what is called the key holder, right? So they're trying to call Michael, and he's not answering his phone.
When the alarm company fails to reach Michael, they reach out to his emergency contact, his mother, Debbie.
So I went over there, and Michael didn't answer the phone. Michael didn't answer the door. His car was missing too, and I was a nervous wreck. Where's my boy? Michael doesn't do this. I looked through windows, walked around the house.
Debbie recalls that Michael told her he was with his friend, 28-year-old Jenna Scott, the day before. So she tries contacting Jenna, hoping she may know where Michael is. When Jenna doesn't answer, Debbie calls Jenna's mother, Karen.
The last time her mom saw her, she was dropping her off to see Michael.
Her response is, well, Jenna's with Michael. And this starts setting off alarm bells with them. And so they were reporting to law enforcement, hey, we have our concerns. So 2 reports are taken, one for Michael and one for Jenna.
We were doing all this searching. The anxiety kept climbing.
It's like they fell off the face of the earth. They just disappeared. So we really had to work backwards at that point to try and figure out who we were looking for.
Born and raised in Temple, Texas, Michael Swearingen always put faith and family first.
Michael was the perfect son. He just had a sweet essence about him. He went to church, and he made a profession of faith, and he was baptized.
Michael really did have everything going for him. He was sweet and kind, cared about everybody. He had a girlfriend. He had his own home.
He worked for Spectrum, which does fiber optics, cable, internet, and he was doing really well at that. He had lots of good friends.
One of his closest friends was Jenna Scott. Like Michael, Jenna came from a tight-knit family.
Jenna was always active, busy. Even as a baby, she was full of energy. And we moved to Texas when she'd just gotten her driver's license when she was 16. She graduated, and she had her daughter, Emery, when she was 18. And we were 100% supportive of her.
Jenna was dating my son, but with all of that pressure on them to be parents at such a young age, both of them ended up going their separate ways. We tried to always make sure that whatever we done as families, it was in Emery's best interest.
Jenna was a very good mother to Emery. Just loved her and doted on her, and did the best she could for a young mom.
In 2012, 22-year-old Jenna earned a nursing degree and then later enrolled in a master's program for counseling.
She's always had compassion for people, and she wanted to make a difference in people's lives.
Michael had met her when she was in nursing school through a friend of hers. Jenna was smart, but she was tender-hearted. I think that's why Michael and Jenna got along so well, because they were both so tender-hearted.
He was like a very big protector of Jenna, and they were close friends. And I mentioned several times to Jenna, why don't you date Michael Swearingen? And she would say, no, he's my best friend.
Jenna and Michael, they were like two peas in a pod. You know, they were like brother and sister.
But on January 4th, 2019, Jenna and Michael have been missing for 24 hours, and law enforcement is growing increasingly concerned that something sinister has occurred.
There was no note, there was no messaging about, hey, we're doing this, so it was also out of character, and so that caused the family to be very concerned.
That night, Temple police receive an update on Michael's car.
I get a call that night, later in the night, saying, hey, they found the car in Austin. Austin Police Department has recovered it for us.
What caught our attention was the fact that Michael absolutely would never go to Austin because that just wasn't his scene. We realized this is absolutely not a place they would be. I don't even know that they would know this area in Austin. And when we located the car, we were on our toes at this point. We needed to figure out what was going on.
When authorities search the abandoned car, they make an alarming discovery.
It's obvious that it's been wiped down. You can smell the bleach and the hydrogen peroxide.
At this point, we knew they were in harm or danger.
Coming up, as the search for Jenna and Michael intensifies, detectives uncover a toxic relationship.
She was panicked, trying to call 911.
She said, my blood will be on your hands.
And a tell-all interview will expose a deadly plot.
This was a man that, again, I trusted implicitly. This man I felt was the safest. My brain just, I couldn't believe what was happening. I couldn't.
Authorities in Temple, Texas are searching for Jenna Scott and Michael Swearingen after they were reported missing on January 4th. 3 days later, detectives meet with both Jenna and Michael's families to get more details on their last known whereabouts.
That Monday, we actually went to the house and started to interview the family and friends who were concerned.
So January 3rd, there's some text messaging from Jenna. There's a message sent back to Karen and says, hey, I'm gonna stay with Michael. Jenna's mom says, well, I thought we were gonna do this. No, I'm gonna stay with him. Jenna's daughter's birthday was coming and they were planning for that. Well, why would she just up and leave?
Family members reveal their theory that Jenna and Michael were targeted by Jenna's ex-boyfriend, Cedric Marks. Detectives learned that Jenna met 40-year-old Cedric in 2015.
Jenna and him met on Tinder, and they had this on and off relationship for about 3 years. Cedric had this charming appearance because he was an MMA fighter. He won a lot of matches. He taught self-defense classes for women. He seemed like the perfect man up front.
He was a single dad, which I had respect for him for that. He would actually bring his kids over, we had meals together, things like that. So we were very accepting of Cedric and his children.
Family members allege that after 3 years of dating, the relationship turned violent.
He had choked her out. He had assaulted her.
She was shaken up quite bad. And the way that I viewed the situation at that time was I need to protect Jenna. And in 2018, we filed for the protective order. And we thought that that was the best choice. to keep him from destroying Jenna's life any further. So we went through that process, and they had the hearing, the protective order hearing, where Cedric basically portrayed Jenna as being this crazy woman. And then Jenna got to, plead her case too. And that's where the judge actually said, no, you're not getting a protective order.
Jenna told the judge after he denied it, "My blood will be on your hands."
Detectives learned that in August 2018, Cedric was charged with breaking into Jenna's home.
Jenna and Emery, her daughter, they were inside, and Jenna was panicked, trying to call 911.
She reports that Cedric has broke into her house. The district attorney finds out and asks for a criminal investigation. This detective actually called him and told him, you can turn yourself in. And that night is when he fled to Michigan. And then that's when the federal warrant was ultimately issued for him.
Now, 5 months later, Jenna and Michael are missing, and their families fear that Cedric may have returned to Texas looking for revenge.
Jenna feared for her life, and Cedric Marks was the reason. So it was kind of a question of, where is Cedric?
Back at the station, detectives reach out to the U.S. Marshal Service to help track down Cedric.
We utilize the Marshal Service a lot. Cedric had a felony warrant, and so that would fall into their purview to help us.
The next day, we got the phone call. Cedric Marks is in custody in Michigan.
The Marshals Task Force is tracking his phone, and they go to a mall in Grand Rapids, and that is where Cedric is taken into custody. So Ashley and I fly up there.
While Cedric is held on the federal warrant, detectives go to his registered address in Muskegon, Michigan, a home owned by his wife, Janelle McDonough.
Cedric was arrested in Michigan, and the next day, the detectives from Texas as well as from Michigan were at the house. It was very surreal.
We realized that he's living with his wife, Janelle, their 2 children, and then his girlfriend, Maya Maxwell, who's pregnant with Cedric's child, all living together in a very weird setup.
Detectives seize the opportunity to learn more about their primary suspect.
We gave them the option to come talk with us, right? Because they're ultimately not who we're trying to investigate, but they're here. So what would you know, right?
I went with them, and I remember I was trying to protect myself, trying to protect the boys. I was trying to protect Cedric at the time because I didn't understand the whole story. I didn't understand what they understood of him at that point in time.
So Corey's interviewing Janelle, and I'm interviewing Maya, and she brings up how Jenna and Michael are missing. We didn't know how much she was involved at that time, but you know something.
Maya is quick to confirm detectives' worst fears.
Michael and Jenna had been killed by Cedric. Maya was actually there and saw what happened.
My name is Maya Maxwell, and I am Cedric Marks's ex-girlfriend. I did tell them everything I could when I could. I tried my best to be as, detailed as possible. I've never stopped helping. I was terrified. I hate saying this. It's so hard for me because I was just trying to survive. I know that's horrible because Jenna and Michael didn't. I'm so sorry.
Temple, Texas authorities have just learned that Cedric Marks is responsible for the disappearance and murders of his ex-girlfriend Jenna Scott and her friend Michael Swearingen.
His girlfriend, Maya Maxwell, admits, yes, she was there with Cedric. And there's so many people depending on us to get this information out of her. So I build a rapport as a female, and I'm going, okay, so how did you meet Cedric? How did you guys come in contact?
It was 2016. I was 24 years old when I moved to Texas. I got on Plenty of Fish, and then that's where I met Cedric. He was goofy like me, kind of quirky and funny, and seemed carefree. He seemed like the perfect guy. And I knew he was a fighter, but he assured me too that he keeps that in the ring. He felt like a safe person.
Originally from Tulsa, Oklahoma, Cedric Marks found his passion for martial arts following a 6-year stint in prison for aggravated burglary when he was 17.
It became a huge thing for him to start down the path of MMA. And he wanted to do MMA because it made him just feel stronger, you know?
In 2002, he met Janelle McDonough in Washington before the couple moved to Texas.
I first met Cedric when we both were in the Navy together. We met in basic training, and he was just a very nice guy at that time, and we became friends. We got married in October 2003. It wasn't the typical marriage that everybody else has. Because of the fact that I'm gay, we just kind of had an open relationship.
And she wanted a baby, so Cedric gave her a baby.
In return, Janelle was comfortable with Cedric dating other women over the years, including Maya Maxwell.
Her understanding of our relationship was that even though we were married, we were just best friends.
He asked me to move in with him, and I said yes. His boys were on board, that everything seemed great. It was just a few days before I was supposed to move in that he tells me that he's going to have to move to Michigan. So he was gonna need me to move to Michigan as well. So I was like, okay.
Maya says Cedric traveled often for work.
I thought that we were exclusive, just us, but there was a point where I started to feel like he was cheating on me. He didn't really stay in touch. There was no video calls. I had uprooted my life. And I just found out I was pregnant with my son.
Maya confronted Cedric, who opened up about his previous relationship with Jenna Scott.
We got in an argument over that, but he again pacified me. And then he tells me that he has a warrant in Texas and that one of his exes, who happens to be Jenna, was accusing him of showing up at her house, but he wasn't ever there, and she's crazy and ruining his life, and she just won't leave him alone, and that's why he had to hurry up and move to Michigan when he did.
Maya admits she traveled back to Texas for the order of protection hearing in 2018.
Well, at that hearing, the judge did not grant her a protective order. So when Jenna walked past me, I remember her saying that I was gross, and I said, "You too."
She didn't understand why Jenna couldn't just leave Cedric alone.
Maya says she was shocked to learn from Cedric that he broke into Jenna's house 1 month later.
So January 2nd, plan was, what I thought, was to get him down to Texas, turn him in again, go right back. But that wasn't what his plan was.
On the evening of January 3rd, Maya claims that Cedric directed her to a residential address in Temple.
She was able to describe the house. I'm pulling up the GPS of Michael's house, and I'm like, is this what you're talking about? And she goes, yep.
Told me he wanted to go hang out with his friend, and he tells me to just go to Walmart, get something to eat, and he tells me, oh, by the way, while you're there, also pick up big black trash bags.
Maya admits she went to Walmart and purchased trash bags before driving to a friend's house.
One of his friends was out of town for the week, so we were staying at her place. Eventually, I hear the garage door, and he walked in with Jenna. She was handcuffed, and he put her in one bathroom, and then he went back out to the garage, and he brought in Michael, handcuffed. I'd never met Michael. I'd never heard of him, and he put Michael in the other bathroom.
Maya tells detectives that's when Cedric began to strangle Michael.
I begged him to stop. I couldn't get up. He had it, and he just turned and looked at me. He told me to look the F away. It lasted a few minutes. And then when he was done, he left him slumped over in the bathtub. I couldn't move. My brain I couldn't believe what was happening. I couldn't. He went in to where Jenna was, picked her up, and he brought her in to see Michael and told her this was our fault. And she and I just looked at each other and didn't say anything. And he carried her out and brought her back into the other bathroom and just asked, "Are you ready?" And the same sounds came out of that bathroom too. I couldn't come forward soon. I wasn't safe.
Following the confession of Maya Maxwell, authorities press her for more information on where the remains of 28-year-old Jenna Scott and 32-year-old Michael Swearingen are located.
She describes Cedric cleaning up everything, and she describes him taking this car to Austin, how they go into Walmart to go buy a shovel with the bodies in the car, until they find the perfect place that Cedric can put them.
Jenna was in garbage bags behind me. And then Michael was in garbage bags all the way in the back.
And then they drive to Oklahoma.
Maya says, they get there, it's late at night, and Cedric starts digging up a spot that's close to his family reunion gatherings. She's helping him with it.
He had told me if I tried to get away, he knew the area better than I did. He's faster. He's a trained fighter. I've never been in a fight in my life. I was pregnant. I was terrified. He's walking me through how, this isn't how he wants relationships to end, but he just got rid of two terrible people that hurt people. And I know I didn't like Jenna before, but all of that went out the door when he ended up murdering Jenna and Michael.
What this murder of Jenna and Michael were is Jenna was going to send him to prison for a long time, and Cedric had no control over her. He was going to go to prison for a long time, and so how do you make that not happen? You take it out. You kill it.
With Maya's help, detectives determined the location where Jenna and Michael's bodies were buried.
We get to Oklahoma, it's cows, it's just pasture. We walk onto the property and we see exactly what she's talking about. You can see the tracks of the tires. And then what we do is we actually have the anthropologist come out because it's a recovery. And they say, yep, they're here and here based on the dirt and the settlement and the different discoloration. It takes a part of your soul that you don't get back. Seeing Michael and Jenna that day in Oklahoma, when we finally got to get to them, a part of me died that day.
They called us and they found the bodies. And all we're doing is crying. We don't know what to do.
When they told us that they had found Jenna and Michael in a shallow grave in Oklahoma, we were devastated. It was a very, very difficult moment in time, for sure.
The medical examiner determines that Michael Swearingen died by strangulation, which matches Maya's account of the murder. But Cedric had been far more violent with Jenna.
We strangled her. We had duct tape on the back of her neck. But he beat her. And he did all the damage to the organs by beating her. That's where the medical comes in saying, listen, any of these things could have been what killed her.
With Maya's story told and the victims' bodies found, police determined that she should be charged with 2 felony counts of tampering with evidence.
She says it herself. Had I just called 911 when I saw Jenna, none of this would have happened. I can tell you confidently, she was not remorseful. She was just upset that this all happened. There's no remorse. She's angry that she's caught.
Authorities switch focus to Cedric Marks, who is being held on a federal warrant in a Michigan jail.
Cedric is not charged with the murders of Jenna and Michael yet because we wanted him to not waive extradition and we wanted him to come to Texas. So he thought he was coming to Texas on his burglar of a habitation warrant only.
On February 2nd, nearly a month after Jenna and Michael's disappearances, Cedric is transported to Texas. Less than 150 miles outside of Temple, chaos ensues.
I get a phone call that says Cedric escaped. I go, what do you mean he escaped?
Detectives learned that Cedric escaped through a window of the transport van while parked at a fast food restaurant.
He was able to kick out, and then that's how he escaped. Cedric's MO was to go get rid of anyone who'd keep him in prison. Well, he already got rid of Jenna and Michael, so the only other option would be to get rid of the family or the investigators who knew what he was capable of.
And so that's very fearful. All the victims, families, what do we need to do to protect them? It was just all about what can we do to get information to the people that are looking for him to recapture him.
A manhunt is underway for former MMA fighter Cedric Marks, the suspected killer of Jenna Scott and Michael Swearingen.
So we get through the initial shock of him escaping. We're telling the marshals, go find him. We have the prison guards out. Everybody's looking for him.
A canine team is brought in to assist law enforcement.
He takes his dog to the exact spot that Cedric drops from the van because he's barefoot. That dog takes off running. So the dog's going, and then they end up going to this house, and the dog starts hitting on this trash bin, and they kick it over, and out pops Cedric, and he'd been crouched in a position for 8 hours in that trash bin. He was gonna wait the perimeter out and everything.
Authorities transport Cedric to the Temple Police Station for an interview.
He was in solitary confinement. So we go in and we're like, we want to talk to you about, Jenna and Michael. And he comes up with, oh my gosh, I had nothing to do with that. I think it's the shortest interview we have with him. He's like, you ruined my life. He was just so mad.
Cedric was charged with double capital murder. He's locked up. He's facing the death penalty.
Behind bars, Cedric continues to maintain his innocence.
I can only imagine what's going on with their family, and I am so sorry for their losses, but I did not and had nothing to do with this. Despite what the media put out, I was not trying to escape. I was actually in fear, and I was not going anywhere at all.
More than 1,000 miles away, the news of Cedric Marks' arrest catches the attention of authorities in Bloomington, Minnesota, due to his connection to a missing persons case 10 years prior.
In October of 2008, April Pease filed for a protective order against Cedric before she disappeared.
Minnesota detectives contact Temple Police and inform them that Cedric has been their #1 suspect in April's disappearance.
She ended up meeting Cedric off of one of those dating apps. I'm not sure which one. I think it was Tinder. For the first, I would say, year, it was good between them. I think she did fall in love with him for a while.
April became pregnant, and in 2005, she and Cedric welcomed their son.
At that time, he was having a baby with Janelle, and then he had a baby with April, very close together.
They're about 4 months apart. And, she stayed with us for a little while.
She told me they got into an argument because she was going out and he choked her out. She called the cops, but nothing ever happened. She ended it, and I was trying to move on then.
April and her son had sought protection at a women's shelter, where she was last seen in March of 2009.
One of the ladies from the shelter called me and said that April, she'd been gone all night, and if she didn't come back, they were going to have to turn my grandson over to CPS. So I tried calling April, and she wouldn't answer the phone.
She ultimately went missing, and the court thought that she had abandoned her child and just left him. And so, regardless of her family protest, the son was given to the father, Cedric.
So, due to circumstances, I raised April's son.
Fast forward 10 years, and Jenna and him are in a volatile relationship. It's the same routine. So that kind of started our thinking, is this a serial killer case?
44-year-old Cedric Marks stands accused of killing his ex-girlfriend, Jenna Scott, and her best friend, Michael Swearingen, with the help of his current girlfriend, Maya Maxwell.
It was retaliation. Cedric Marks is upset that Jenna had filed criminal charges against him.
Cedric was jealous of Michael. I think he thought something was going on between Michael and Jenna.
Cedric has also been a suspect in the disappearance of April Pease 10 years earlier, raising fears authorities might be dealing with a serial killer.
It's the protective orders and the physical abuse and the strangling and all these things. Like, this is a pattern of behavior for someone.
On January 30th, 2019, investigators in Texas and Minnesota team up to interview several witnesses in the April Pease case, including another girlfriend he had at the time, Kelly Sorensen.
So we go, and Kelly interviews with both the Minnesota police and us, and she was able to recall a situation with April and Cedric.
He has killed April Pease.
Then we find out that Kelly had actually been present with Cedric.
April Pease first went missing in 2009, and there was this custody battle with Cedric at the time.
Kelly tells us Cedric knew, I'm gonna go to jail, and I want my son. And so he found April. She's actually located out of a woman's shelter for women and children that was to protect them from violent offenses. He finds her, he watches her, and as she's going back into it, they take her and drag her to a car, and he decides to kill her.
With Kelly's help, investigators attempt to track down April's body, but are unsuccessful.
After the first year, I knew that she wasn't alive anymore. But I still hoped to be able to find her remains. I talked with a detective, and her hope and their intent is to still bring my daughter home to me.
10 years after April's disappearance, investigators uncover evidence that may prove Cedric's guilt.
I actually ended up being arrested for harboring a fugitive, but it was all dropped, and I continued to help them and try to locate April and, try to help them get closure for everybody.
Janelle communicated with us. There were things that were not in our search warrant that she consented to allowing us to take.
There was a box that Janelle had of Cedric's items that he would just keep and collect. Well, there is a tape. This is before the disappearance of April, and he just talks about how much he loves his boys and that he wanted to get them together, and he just wanted his son back, and he was going to do whatever he had to do, and he made up his mind. To us who are investigating him and know Cedric to an extent, that's the equivalent of a confession. He gets charged while he's in jail at Bell County for April Pease's murder.
2 years later, Minnesota prosecutors aren't prepared to move forward in April Pease's case, but Texas prosecutors are, if they can flip Cedric's accomplice, Maya Maxwell.
They needed Maya's testimony. It was really crucial in this whole case.
Prosecutors agreed to a lesser sentence in exchange for Maya's testimony. Maya takes the deal, pleading guilty to 2 counts of tampering with a corpse.
She got 20 years in prison with the chance of parole.
I did tell them everything, and unfortunately in Texas, that meant that I had to be part of it, and for them to get justice, then that's fine.
On Monday, April 17th, 2023, Cedric Mark's murder trial for Jenna Scott and Michael Swearingen begins.
Cedric believes he's the smartest man in the room. He believes he knows the law better than any lawyer.
He decided to defend himself.
Prosecutors fight back with a mountain of circumstantial evidence.
We saw phone extractions and timelines of exactly where he was at a certain time and date, and it lined up completely with the murders.
We went to Henrietta, Oklahoma, where we know that shovels were purchased, and got the video there, and you see Cedric and Maya in footage.
2 weeks into the trial, Maya takes the stand as the state's star witness.
When Maya walked into the courtroom, there was almost a shift. She would not make eye contact with Cedric. I think Maya really, really regretted everything. She felt terrible, was breaking down into tears, and kept apologizing.
They did not deserve that sick man did.
There are evil people out here in this world, and he's one of them. He was able to manipulate the girls that he was in relationships with.
Following a 6-week trial, the jury hands down its verdict.
Cedric Marks was found guilty of double capital murder for Michael and Jenna. He was sentenced to death.
There's some comfort in knowing that he is going to suffer for his actions, but there's no justice for murdering a young woman and man like that.
So Michael and Jenna's case is closed with this conviction. April's is charged and still open, but that there's no statute of limitation to murder, and sometimes we just have to be patient.
Cedric Marks took two amazing people away from their families.
No mother, no family would ever have to go through what we did. We had to go through this and go through the trial. It's just terrible. It'll never go away.
There are places in the world where people expect danger. Cities where noise never stops. Where tension sits just beneath the surface. But then there are places like Adelaide. Quiet. Orderly. A city where life moves at a measured pace. Where neighborhoods are familiar. Where routines rarely change. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Adelaide was not a place people associated with fear. It was stable. Predictable. The kind of place where parents believed their children were safe. Not because danger didn't exist, but because it felt distant. Abstract. Something that happened somewhere else. And for a long time, nothing seemed to challenge that belief. Until, slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to change. Not in a way that drew immediate attention. There were no sudden alarms. No single event that forced people to stop and look around. Instead, it began with absence. A missing person. Then, later, another. At first, there was no reason to connect them. Each disappearance stood on its own. Separate. Unrelated. That is how most people saw it. That is how it was understood. Because nothing about the circumstances suggested anything larger. There was no clear pattern. No visible link. Just individuals who, for different reasons, were no longer there. And in a city like Adelaide, that kind of absence did not immediately signal something extraordinary. People come and go. Lives change. Sometimes, individuals drift away from the spaces they once occupied. It happens quietly. And often, without explanation. But as time passed, something began to feel different. Not obvious. Not urgent. Just inconsistent. The people who were disappearing shared something subtle. Not a direct connection. But a similarity. They were young. Teenage boys. And they existed, in one way or another, on the edges of visibility. Not entirely isolated. But not deeply rooted either. The kind of individuals whose absence might not immediately disrupt the structure around them. Whose lives, while important, were not always closely observed. And that detail, small as it seemed, would become central to everything that followed. Because it created a space. A space where something could happen without immediate recognition. A space where patterns could form slowly. Quietly. Without being seen. At first, there was no sense of urgency. No widespread concern that something systematic was unfolding. Because nothing about the situation demanded that conclusion. There were no witnesses describing violence. No clear evidence of coordinated action. Only the gradual accumulation of absence. An absence, by its nature, does not draw attention quickly. It builds. Piece by piece. Until eventually, there are enough pieces that something begins to take shape. But by then, time has already passed. And in that time, whatever was happening had continued. Uninterrupted. Unrecognized. What would later be known as the family murders did not begin as a clearly defined case. It did not announce itself. It did not arrive with clarity. Instead, it existed in fragments. Moments separated by time. Events that, on their own, did not reveal their connection. And that is what made it so difficult to see. Because the human mind looks for patterns. But only when those patterns are visible. Here, they were not. Not yet. The early years of this case were defined not by action, but by a lack of recognition. A period where something was happening. But no one fully understood what that something was. And within that gap, between event and understanding, the story truly began. A story not of a single act, but of repetition. Not of one individual, but of a group. Unseen, undefined, and never fully identified. Operating within the ordinary. Blending into the environment that surrounded them. Using familiarity as cover. And leaving behind only what could not be ignored forever. Absence. Because absence, given enough time, eventually demands explanation. But by the time that demand is recognized, the story is already well underway. And in Adelaide, by the time people began to ask the right questions, the pattern had already been forming. 4 years. The invisible vulnerability in order to understand what happened in Adelaide during the late 1970s and early 1980s. It is necessary to look beyond the events themselves and focus instead on the people at the center of them. Those whose lives were interrupted, often quietly, and without immediate recognition of what their absence meant. The victims in what would later be known as the family murders were not connected by friendship, family, or shared routines. They did not belong to a single group, did not move within the same clearly defined social circle, and did not disappear under identical circumstances. At first glance, there was nothing that tied them together in a way that would immediately raise concern. And yet, over time, a pattern began to emerge, not one built on direct relationships, but on vulnerability. The individuals targeted were teenage boys, a group that, in most societies, is often seen as independent, mobile, and capable of navigating public spaces on their own. This perception, however, can obscure a more complex reality. Many of these individuals existed on the margins of structured social environments. They were not always under close supervision. Their movements were not always tracked or questioned. Their routines allowed for flexibility, and with that flexibility came periods of time where their absence might not be immediately noticed or urgently investigated. This lack of immediate visibility played a critical role. In a city like South Australia, where communities were generally stable and crime of this nature was not expected, the disappearance of a young person did not automatically trigger the assumption of coordinated violence. Instead, explanations often lean toward individual circumstances, personal decisions, temporary absences, or situations that did not suggest a broader pattern. This context created a delay, not only in recognition but in response. The victims were not invisible in the sense that they were unknown or unimportant. Rather, they were invisible within the systems that detect urgency. Their lives did not immediately intersect with mechanisms that would amplify concern. They did not all have strong, overlapping networks of people who could collectively identify a pattern forming across multiple cases. And so, each disappearance remained isolated, contained within its own narrative, rather than contributing to a larger, more alarming picture. The environment in which this occurred reinforced that isolation. Adelaide at the time was not a city defined by unpredictability or high levels of organized crime. It was, by most measures, a place where daily life followed expected rhythms. This sense of normalcy influenced perception. When events occur in an environment that feels stable, they are more likely to be interpreted as anomalies rather than indicators of systemic issues. It takes repetition to challenge that perception, and repetition requires time. As the number of victims increased, eventually reaching at least 5 confirmed individuals, the similarities became harder to ignore. They were not dramatic similarities. There were no identical timelines or identical locations. But there was a consistent profile. Young males. Individuals who could be approached in social situations. Individuals who could be isolated without immediate intervention. Individuals whose absence, at least initially, did not disrupt a larger network in a way that would force rapid escalation. This is where the concept of vulnerability becomes central. Vulnerability is not always visible. It does not always present as weakness. In many cases, it exists within the structure of everyday life, within routines that allow independence, within environments that lack close monitoring, within social conditions that do not immediately prioritize detection. The victims in this case existed within that space. They were not defined by a single characteristic, but by a convergence of factors that made them accessible to those who intended harm. Understanding this does not assign blame. It does not suggest that anything about their behavior caused what happened. Instead, it highlights the conditions that allowed the crimes to occur without immediate recognition. It explains why the pattern remained hidden for as long as it did. And it underscores a broader reality, that the visibility of a person within a community can directly influence how quickly their absence is understood as a crisis. In the early stages of this case, that crisis had not yet fully formed. The connections were not yet clear. The pattern was still incomplete. And within that incompleteness, the victims remained, in a critical sense, unseen, not as individuals, but as part of something larger that had not yet been recognized. A repeating method hidden in plain sight, as the events that would later be grouped under the family murders continued to unfold across South Australia. What remained most difficult to grasp was not just the violence itself, but the consistency hidden beneath it. There was no single moment when everything became clear. No immediate recognition that these incidents were connected. Instead, what existed were fragments, individual encounters, separate disappearances, and isolated discoveries that, at first, resisted interpretation as part of a unified pattern. But when examined collectively, a method begins to emerge. Not a chaotic or impulsive sequence of actions, but something more structured, more deliberate. The available information indicates that the crimes were not carried out by a single individual acting alone, but by a group, an organized presence operating within ordinary social environments. This distinction is critical, because it changes the nature of the interaction between offender and victim. The approach was not random in the sense of being unpredictable, rather, it followed a consistent logic. The victims were approached in social situations, moments where interaction would not appear unusual. These were not overtly forced encounters. There was no immediate indication of danger at the point of contact. Instead, the approach relied on familiarity, on the natural dynamics of conversation, trust, and proximity that occur in everyday settings. This is what allowed the initial stage of the incident to pass without detection. There was no clear disruption. No visible struggle that would alert others. From that point, the situation shifted. The victims were taken to private or secluded locations, spaces where visibility was reduced and control could be established. It is within these confined environments that the nature of the crime became evident. The victims were restrained, held, and subjected to violence before their deaths. These were not instantaneous events. The data suggests a period of control, a phase in which the victims were kept in a contained setting before the final outcome. This element introduces a disturbing dimension, not because of speculation, but because of its repetition. It indicates a process, a sequence that was followed more than once. After the victims were killed, their bodies were transported and left in remote areas. Locations that were not immediately accessible, not frequently monitored, and not likely to be searched without specific reason. This choice of disposal further delayed discovery and contributed to the fragmentation of the case. Each body, when found, appeared disconnected from the others. There was no single site that linked them all. No central location that could immediately suggest a pattern. Instead, the evidence was dispersed, both geographically and temporally. This dispersion played a crucial role in maintaining the illusion of isolation between incidents. The most striking aspect of this pattern is not just its repetition, but its ability to remain unnoticed for an extended period. The crimes occurred over several years, following a similar structure each time, yet without immediate recognition of that structure. This suggests a level of operational consistency that blended into the surrounding environment. The offenders did not need to create elaborate concealment. The existing conditions, limited visibility, socially vulnerable victims, and delayed reporting, provided a form of natural cover. Each stage of the incident relied on what was already present: ordinary interactions, accessible spaces, and the absence of immediate scrutiny. This is what made the pattern so difficult to detect. It did not stand out. It did not disrupt the environment in a way that demanded instant attention. Instead, it moved through that environment, using its normal functions as a framework. Over time, however, repetition leaves traces. Even when those traces are separated, even when they are incomplete, they begin to form connections. The similarities in victim profile, the circumstances of disappearance, the nature of the locations involved, all of these elements gradually aligned. But during the period in which the incidents were occurring, that alignment was not yet visible. Each case remained its own event, its own narrative, its own unexplained absence. And within that separation, the method continued. Quietly. Systematically. Hidden not by complexity, but by familiarity. Trying to connect the unconnected. The investigation into what would later be recognized as the family murders did not begin as a unified effort. It began in fragments, much like the incidents themselves. Each disappearance, each discovery, entered the system as an individual case, separate, self-contained, and lacking the defining characteristics that would immediately suggest coordination. In South Australia, where the expectation of organized violent crime was low, the early stages of inquiry reflected that assumption. Investigators approached each case on its own terms, examining personal circumstances, last known movements, and any immediate connections that could explain what had happened. But those explanations did not come easily. There were no direct witnesses to the full sequence of events. No one who could describe, from beginning to end, how a victim was approached, taken, and ultimately killed. This absence of first-hand accounts created a gap, a space where reconstruction depended entirely on indirect evidence and inference. Compounding this difficulty was the nature of the victims themselves. As established, they were individuals whose social networks did not always provide clear, overlapping connections. This meant that traditional investigative strategies, tracing relationships, identifying shared contacts, mapping common locations, produced limited results in the early stages. Each case pointed inward rather than outward, toward individual circumstances rather than a broader pattern. Time became another complicating factor. The incidents did not occur in rapid succession. They were spread across several years, with intervals that made it difficult to perceive continuity. In an investigative context, time gaps can obscure patterns. They create the impression of isolated events rather than a sequence. And without a clear sequence, there is no immediate reason to assume a single source. For a period, that is exactly how these cases were understood, as unrelated, unfortunate events occurring within the same general region, but without a shared cause. However, as more cases accumulated, eventually confirming at least 5 victims, the limitations of that interpretation became harder to ignore. The similarities, subtle at first, began to take on greater significance. Investigators started to notice recurring elements: the age and gender of the victims, the circumstances under which they were last seen, and the eventual discovery of their bodies in remote, or less accessible areas. None of these factors alone proved a connection. But together, they suggested the possibility of one. This marked the beginning of a shift in perspective. The investigation moved from isolated analysis to comparative analysis. Instead of asking what happened in each individual case, investigators began asking what was shared across cases. This shift is often where complex investigations either gain clarity or encounter deeper uncertainty. In this instance, it did both. On one hand, the recognition of common elements allowed investigators to consider a new hypothesis: that the crimes were not the work of a single offender acting independently, but potentially a group operating with some level of coordination. This hypothesis aligned with the structured nature of the incidents, the consistent method of approach, control, and disposal. On the other hand, this new perspective introduced additional complexity. Investigating a potential group dynamic is inherently more difficult than pursuing a single suspect. It requires identifying not just one individual's behavior, but the interactions between multiple people. It raises questions about roles, relationships, and degrees of involvement, questions that are difficult to answer without direct evidence or testimony. Investigators began to examine social connections more closely, not just between victims, but between potential suspects. They looked for overlaps in social circles, shared environments, and any indications that certain individuals might have had access to the victims. This process involved revisiting earlier assumptions, reanalyzing existing information, and attempting to construct a network where none had been previously recognized. Despite these efforts, significant limitations remained. The lack of direct witnesses continued to constrain the investigation. The evidence, while suggestive, was not definitive enough to clearly identify all individuals involved, or to fully reconstruct the structure of the group. Each new piece of information added context, but not complete clarity. The turning point, therefore, was not a single discovery or breakthrough moment. It was a gradual realization, a shift from seeing the cases as separate to understanding them as connected. This realization did not solve the case, but it changed the framework in which it was approached. It allowed investigators to ask different questions, to pursue different leads, and to consider possibilities that had previously been dismissed. But even with this shift, the investigation remained incomplete. The connections, while present, were not strong enough to form a complete picture. The structure of the group, if it existed as suspected, could not be fully defined. And the absence of conclusive evidence meant that some aspects of the case would remain unresolved. What this phase of the investigation ultimately reveals is not just the difficulty of solving complex crimes, but the challenge of recognizing them in the first place. Patterns do not always present themselves clearly. They must be identified, often slowly, through comparison and persistence. And in this case, by the time the pattern was recognized, much had already occurred without that recognition guiding the response. Partial justice, when the investigation into the family murders reached the stage of legal action, it did so without the clarity that typically defines a fully resolved case. By this point, authorities in South Australia had moved beyond the early uncertainty that characterized the initial years. There was now a recognition that the crimes were not isolated, that the victims, at least 5 confirmed, were connected through pattern rather than coincidence, and that the involvement of more than one individual was a strong possibility. Yet recognition is not the same as resolution. The legal process depends on evidence that can withstand scrutiny, on connections that can be demonstrated rather than inferred, and on responsibility that can be assigned with precision. In this case, those requirements proved difficult to fully satisfy. Some individuals were identified, investigated, and ultimately arrested in connection with aspects of the crimes. Their involvement was not hypothetical. It was supported by evidence considered sufficient for prosecution in specific instances. These arrests marked a significant moment. They confirmed that the investigation had not been without result, that the pattern identified by investigators did correspond to real individuals whose actions contributed to the events under scrutiny. However, from the outset, it was clear that these proceedings would not provide a complete account. The structure of the crimes, as understood through the investigation, suggested coordination, repetition, and the likely presence of multiple participants. Yet the evidence available did not allow for the full identification of all those involved, nor did it clarify the exact roles each individual may have played within the broader sequence of events. As the cases moved through the judicial system, this limitation became central. The trials focused on what could be proven, not on what was suspected. Each charge had to be supported by specific evidence linking an individual to a particular act. This is the foundation of legal process. It does not operate on patterns alone, but on demonstrable connections between person and action. In situations where those connections are incomplete, the scope of the trial is necessarily reduced. The result was a form of accountability that was real, but partial. Convictions were secured against certain individuals, establishing that criminal responsibility existed, and that some degree of justice could be delivered. These outcomes mattered. They provided acknowledgement of wrongdoing. They affirmed that the events were not beyond the reach of the law. But they also highlighted what remained unresolved. There was no single trial that encompassed the entirety of the crimes. No proceeding that laid out, in full, the structure of the group, or the complete sequence of events across all victims. Instead, the legal outcomes were fragmented, mirroring the fragmented nature of the investigation itself. This fragmentation created a distinction between legal truth and complete understanding. Legally, the cases that were brought to court reached conclusions. Verdicts were delivered. Sentences were imposed. Within the framework of the law, those outcomes represented closure for the specific charges addressed. But beyond that framework, questions persisted. The possibility of additional perpetrators remained. The extent of coordination within the group was not definitively established. The full narrative, how the crimes began, how they evolved, and how they were sustained over time, was not entirely reconstructed within the courtroom. This is what defines the outcome as partial justice. It is not the absence of justice, but the presence of limits. Limits imposed by evidence, by time, and by the inherent complexity of the case. The legal system functioned as it is designed to function, cautiously, deliberately, and within the boundaries of what can be proven. But those boundaries did not encompass everything that investigators, and the public, suspected to be true. For the families and communities affected, this distinction carried weight. The acknowledgement of guilt in certain cases provided a form of validation, a recognition that the losses were the result of deliberate actions rather than unexplained circumstances. Yet the absence of a complete account meant that some aspects of those losses remained undefined. There was no singular narrative that could be pointed to as the definitive explanation of what had occurred. Instead, there were multiple narratives, each tied to a specific legal case, each addressing a portion of the overall picture. In the end, the trials did not close the case in the way that many might expect. They did not eliminate uncertainty. They did not answer every question. What they did provide was structure, a framework of accountability that confirmed key elements of the investigation while leaving others unresolved. And within that framework, the case reached a conclusion that was both definitive and incomplete. A conclusion where justice was present, but not absolute. The case that never fully closed in the years following the investigations and legal proceedings connected to the family murders, the impact did not fade in a clear or immediate way. There was no single moment when the community in South Australia could collectively decide that the story had ended. Instead, what remained was a lingering sense of incompleteness, an awareness that while parts of the truth had been uncovered, the full shape of what had occurred was still not entirely known. This lingering uncertainty became part of the case itself. It influenced how people understood not only what had happened, but how it had been allowed to happen over such an extended period of time. One of the most immediate effects was a shift in perception. Before these events, Adelaide had been widely regarded as a place of stability, a city where serious, organized violence was not expected to emerge from within the community. That perception did not disappear overnight, but it changed. The idea that harm could originate from within familiar social environments, rather than from distant or clearly defined threats, introduced a new layer of awareness. This awareness was not always visible in daily life, but it existed beneath the surface, influencing how people thought about safety, trust, and vulnerability. The fact that the victims were young and, in many cases, socially vulnerable added to this shift. Their experiences highlighted a reality that had not been fully acknowledged before, that individuals who exist on the margins of visibility are often at greater risk, not because of anything they have done, but because their absence does not immediately trigger collective attention. This realization extended beyond the case itself. It prompted broader reflection on how communities recognize and respond to vulnerability, and how systems of support might fail to detect patterns when those patterns involve individuals who are not closely connected to larger networks. The case also raised enduring questions about the nature of organized crime within a community context. The possibility that multiple individuals were involved, acting in coordination, over a period of years, challenged assumptions about how such activity would manifest. There was no single identifiable structure that could be fully mapped, no complete list of participants, no definitive explanation of how the group functioned. This lack of clarity made the case difficult to contain within traditional narratives. It was not simply a matter of identifying a perpetrator and closing the case. Instead, it remained open in a conceptual sense, with unanswered questions continuing to shape its interpretation. Among the most persistent of these questions was the issue of scale. If some individuals were identified and convicted, but not all, then how large was the group? Were there others who had not been discovered, or whose involvement could not be proven? The available evidence did not provide definitive answers. And without those answers, the boundaries of the case remained uncertain. This uncertainty extended to the possibility of additional victims. While at least 5 were confirmed, the absence of a complete understanding of the group's activities left open the question of whether the full extent of the crimes had been uncovered. This is a particularly difficult aspect of any investigation to confront, because it exists in a space between evidence and possibility. It cannot be confirmed without new information, but it cannot be entirely dismissed either. Over time, the case became not only a subject of investigation, but a point of reference. It was discussed, revisited, and analyzed, not because new conclusions had been reached, but because the existing conclusions were incomplete. Each return to the case brought with it the same set of considerations: what is known, what is suspected, and what remains beyond reach. This ongoing engagement reflects the deeper impact of the events. They did not resolve cleanly. They did not fit within a narrative that moves from problem to solution. Instead, they left behind a structure that includes both resolution and ambiguity, both certainty and doubt. In this way, the case serves as a reminder of the limits inherent in any investigative process. Even with sustained effort, even with the application of legal frameworks and analytical methods, there are situations where not every element can be fully reconstructed. Evidence may be incomplete. Connections may remain unproven. And time itself may obscure details that cannot be recovered. None of this diminishes the significance of what was achieved, the identification of patterns, the prosecution of certain individuals, the acknowledgement of harm. But it does define the boundaries of that achievement. It clarifies that resolution, in some cases, is not absolute. It exists alongside what cannot be fully resolved. Ultimately, the legacy of this case is not contained solely in its outcomes, but in the questions it continues to raise. Questions about visibility, about vulnerability, about how communities interpret absence and respond to it. Questions about how patterns are recognized, and how long it can take for that recognition to occur. And perhaps most importantly, questions about how much can truly be known when events unfold in fragments, across time, and within environments that do not immediately reveal their complexity. These questions do not have simple answers. They remain, much like the case itself, open to interpretation. And in that openness, the story continues, not as an active investigation, but as an enduring reflection on what was seen, what was missed, and what may never be fully understood. What remains unresolved even after the investigations, the partial convictions, and the public acknowledgement of what had occurred, the case of the family murders did not settle into a fixed, fully understood narrative. Instead, it remained open in a more subtle way, not legally active, but conceptually unfinished. In South Australia, the passage of time did not erase the questions left behind, it simply changed how those questions were approached. Rather than being urgent, they became persistent. Rather than demanding immediate answers, they lingered in the background, shaping how the case was remembered and discussed. One of the most significant unresolved elements is the structure of the group believed to be involved. The available evidence suggested coordination, repetition, and shared behavior, yet it did not provide a complete map of who was involved or how they were connected. This absence of clarity creates a unique kind of uncertainty. It is not the uncertainty of not knowing whether a crime occurred that is established, but the uncertainty of not knowing its full scope. Without a complete understanding of the group, it becomes difficult to define the boundaries of the case. Where does it begin? Where does it end? Which actions are connected and which are not? These questions remain without definitive answers. Closely related to this is the issue of individual roles within the suspected group. Even among those who were identified and prosecuted, the extent of their involvement could not always be placed within a fully reconstructed sequence of events. In cases involving multiple participants, understanding who did what, and under what circumstances, is essential for creating a complete narrative. Here, that narrative remains partial. There are segments that are known, supported by evidence and legal findings, but there are also gaps where the sequence of actions cannot be fully determined. These gaps are not simply missing details, they represent entire portions of the story that cannot be conclusively described. Another unresolved dimension concerns the possibility of additional victims. While at least 5 individuals were confirmed, the nature of the crimes, their duration, their repetition, and the lack of complete identification of all perpetrators, leaves open the question of whether all victims have been accounted for. This is a difficult possibility to address, because it exists without definitive proof. It is shaped by inference rather than confirmation, by the recognition that incomplete information can mask a larger reality. The presence of this possibility influences how the case is perceived. It prevents it from being fully contained within the known facts, extending its implications beyond what has been formally established. There is also the question of how the crimes were sustained over time without earlier detection. The answer is not singular. It involves a combination of factors: the vulnerability of the victims, the absence of immediate connections between cases, the time gaps that obscured patterns, and the limitations of available evidence. Each of these factors contributed to the delay in recognition. But even when considered together, they do not fully explain how the pattern remained undetected for so long. This is not a failure of any single system or process. It is an illustration of how complex events can exist within ordinary environments without immediately disrupting them. It highlights the limits of perception, the ways in which human attention is shaped by expectation, and how events that do not fit those expectations can go unrecognized. Over time, the case has come to represent more than its individual components. It is no longer viewed solely as a sequence of crimes, but as a broader example of how patterns form, how they are missed, and how they are eventually recognized. This shift in perspective does not resolve the unanswered questions, but it reframes them. It places them within a larger context, one that extends beyond the specifics of the case to include the processes through which understanding is developed. In this sense, the unresolved elements are not just gaps in information, they are part of the case's lasting significance. They remind us that not all narratives reach complete closure, that some remain open not because of ongoing investigation, but because of inherent limitations in what can be known. These limitations do not diminish the importance of what has been established. The identification of victims, the recognition of patterns, and the legal accountability that was achieved all remain critical outcomes. But they exist alongside what could not be fully determined. And it is this coexistence, of knowledge and uncertainty, that defines the case in its entirety. As time continues to pass, the details may become less immediate, but the structure of the case remains. It persists as a reference point, a reminder of how easily complexity can exist within familiarity, and how difficult it can be to fully reconstruct events that unfold across time, involving multiple individuals, and leaving behind only partial evidence. In the end, what remains unresolved is not just a list of unanswered questions, but an enduring recognition of the limits of certainty. A recognition that even when much has been uncovered, there can still be aspects of a story that remain beyond complete understanding. How environment shapes perception. To fully understand the enduring complexity of the family murders, it is necessary to examine not only the actions themselves, but the environment in which those actions took place. Because the environment did not simply serve as a backdrop, it actively influenced how the events were perceived, interpreted, and ultimately understood. In Adelaide during the late 1970s and early 1980s, the prevailing sense of normality was not superficial. It was deeply embedded in the structure of daily life. Communities were stable, routines were predictable, and social interactions followed familiar patterns. This stability created a framework through which unusual events were interpreted. When something occurred that did not immediately fit within that framework, it was often understood in isolation rather than as part of a broader disruption. This is a natural cognitive response. Human perception tends to favor explanations that align with existing expectations. When a city is widely regarded as safe, events that contradict that perception are less likely to be immediately grouped together as evidence of a larger problem. Instead, they are processed individually, each one assigned its own explanation, its own context, its own boundary. This process, while logical on the surface, can delay the recognition of patterns that only become visible when multiple events are viewed collectively. The environment in South Australia at the time reinforced this tendency. There were no widespread indicators of organized violent crime that would prompt investigators or the public to immediately consider that possibility. Without that expectation, the threshold for recognizing coordination was significantly higher. It required not just one or two incidents, but a series of events that, over time, began to reveal similarities that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Another critical aspect of the environment was the nature of social visibility. As previously established, the victims were individuals who, for various reasons, did not occupy positions of high visibility within tightly connected networks. This meant that their absence, while significant, did not always trigger immediate, large-scale responses. In environments where individuals are closely monitored through overlapping relationships, family, school, community organizations, patterns of disappearance can be identified more quickly. But in situations where those networks are less dense or less interconnected, the detection of patterns becomes more difficult. Each case remains contained within its own limited sphere of awareness. This containment is not intentional. It is a byproduct of how social systems function. Information spreads through connections, and when those connections are limited, the spread of information is correspondingly restricted. In the context of this case, that limitation contributed to the delay in recognizing that multiple victims shared similar circumstances. The environment also influenced the behavior of those responsible. The absence of immediate detection, the lack of visible connection between cases, and the general perception of safety created conditions in which repeated actions could occur without immediate interruption. This does not imply that the environment caused the crimes, but it does illustrate how certain conditions can reduce the likelihood of early intervention. When actions do not produce immediate, observable consequences, they can continue longer than they otherwise might. Over time, as more information became available, and as investigators began to compare cases more directly, the influence of the environment began to shift. What had once been interpreted as isolated incidents started to be seen as interconnected. This shift did not occur suddenly. It required the accumulation of data, the willingness to re-examine earlier assumptions, and the recognition that the existing framework of interpretation was insufficient. This moment of reassessment is critical in any complex investigation. It represents the point at which perception begins to align more closely with reality. But even then, the influence of the environment does not disappear entirely. It continues to shape how the case is understood, how its implications are interpreted, and how its lessons are applied. In retrospect, it becomes clear that the environment played a dual role. On one hand, it contributed to the delay in recognition by reinforcing assumptions of normality and safety. On the other hand, it provided the context necessary for understanding how such a pattern could exist without immediate detection. This duality is important because it prevents the case from being viewed in overly simplistic terms. It is not merely a story of actions and consequences, but a story of perception and interpretation. A story of how expectations influence awareness, and how awareness, in turn, shapes response. Ultimately, examining the environment reveals that the case was not hidden in the traditional sense. It was not concealed by extraordinary measures or complex deception. Instead, it existed within the ordinary, moving through familiar spaces and routines without immediately disrupting them. And it is this aspect, the ability of something significant to exist within what appears to be normal, that gives the case its enduring complexity. It challenges the assumption that danger is always visible, always obvious, always separate from the everyday. And in doing so, it reshapes how that everyday is understood. When separate stories become one for a long time, what defined the unfolding of the family murders was not what was known, but what was not yet connected. Each case existed independently, shaped by its own timeline, its own circumstances, and its own limited set of information. In South Australia, investigators approached each disappearance and each discovery as a distinct event, because there was no immediate reason to do otherwise. This is how most investigations begin, by focusing narrowly, by attempting to resolve individual cases before expanding outward. But in this instance, that approach, while logical, delayed a broader realization. Pattern recognition is not an instantaneous process. It does not occur the moment multiple events share similarities. Instead, it requires accumulation of data, of observations, of small consistencies that, on their own, do not carry enough weight to redefine understanding. It is only when those consistencies reach a certain threshold that they begin to challenge existing interpretations. In this case, that threshold was reached gradually. As more victims were identified, at least 5 confirmed, the similarities between them became increasingly difficult to dismiss. They were not identical, but they were consistent. Teenage boys. Individuals who could be approached in social environments. Individuals who disappeared under circumstances that did not immediately suggest force or visible conflict. These shared elements began to form a framework, a structure that could support a different kind of explanation. The shift from isolated cases to a connected pattern did not occur in a single moment of discovery. There was no piece of evidence that suddenly unified everything. Instead, it was a process of comparison. Investigators began to place cases side by side, examining not just what was unique about each one, but what was common across all of them. This comparative approach revealed something that had not been visible before: repetition. Repetition in victim profile. Repetition in method. Repetition in outcome. And repetition, in investigative terms, is significant. It suggests intention. It suggests structure. It suggests that the events are not random, but part of a deliberate sequence. This realization marked a turning point in how the case was understood. Once a pattern is recognized, the entire framework of an investigation changes. Questions shift from what happened here to how does this connect to what happened elsewhere. The focus expands. The search becomes not just about identifying a cause for a single event, but about understanding a system of actions that spans multiple events. In the context of this case, that shift led to the consideration of a group dynamic. The consistency of the method, combined with the duration of the incidents, suggested that more than one individual could be involved. This possibility introduced a new layer of complexity. It required investigators to think not only about individual behavior, but about coordination, about how multiple people might interact, share information, and participate in a repeated sequence of actions. At the same time, the recognition of a pattern also highlighted the limitations of earlier assumptions. It became clear that the initial interpretation of the cases as isolated incidents had been insufficient. Not incorrect, given the information available at the time, but incomplete. This is an important distinction. Investigative processes are shaped by the information they have access to. When that information is limited, conclusions are necessarily provisional. As more information becomes available, those conclusions must be re-evaluated. This re-evaluation is not a sign of failure, it is a fundamental part of the process. However, even after the pattern was recognized, challenges remained. Identifying a pattern does not automatically reveal its full structure. It provides direction, but not necessarily resolution. In this case, while the connections between victims and incidents became clearer, the identification of all individuals involved did not follow immediately. The pattern pointed toward coordination, but the evidence required to fully define that coordination was still incomplete. This created a situation where the case was understood in a general sense, but not in full detail. The existence of a pattern was no longer in question, but the specifics of that pattern, its full scope, its exact structure, its complete list of participants, remained partially obscured. This distinction between general understanding and detailed knowledge is critical. It shows that recognition is only one stage in the process of investigation. It is necessary, but not sufficient on its own. It must be followed by the gathering of evidence, the establishment of connections, and the construction of a complete narrative. In this case, that final stage was only partially achieved. Still, the recognition of the pattern changed everything. It transformed a series of disconnected stories into a single, more complex narrative. It provided a framework for interpreting past events and for guiding future investigation. And it ensured that what had once been seen as isolated would no longer be understood that way. In the end, pattern recognition did not solve the case entirely, but it made it visible. And visibility, even when incomplete, is the first step toward understanding. What could not be proven as the investigation into the family murders progressed, one reality became increasingly clear. Understanding what likely happened and proving what happened are not the same thing. In South Australia, investigators had reached a point where patterns were recognized, connections were suspected, and the possibility of a coordinated group had been seriously considered. But the transition from suspicion to proof required something more. Something that could withstand legal scrutiny. Something that could move beyond inference and into certainty. That requirement exposed the limits of the case. Evidence, by its nature, must be concrete. It must establish a direct link between individuals and actions. It must show not only that something occurred, but who was responsible, how it happened, and under what circumstances. In cases where events unfold over long periods of time, involve multiple participants, and leave behind fragmented traces, meeting that standard becomes exceptionally difficult. This is precisely what occurred here. Much of the available information pointed toward a structured pattern, but it did not always provide the level of detail necessary to fully reconstruct each incident. There were gaps, moments where the sequence of events could not be clearly defined, where the presence or involvement of specific individuals could not be conclusively demonstrated. These gaps were not the result of a lack of effort. Investigators examined what they had, revisited earlier findings, and attempted to build connections wherever possible. But evidence cannot be created, it can only be discovered. And in this case, what could be discovered was incomplete. One of the most significant limitations was the absence of direct witnesses. No one was able to describe the full progression of the crimes from beginning to end. Without that perspective, the reconstruction of events relied on indirect indicators, patterns of behavior, similarities between cases, and the eventual discovery of victims. While these indicators are valuable, they do not always meet the threshold required for definitive legal conclusions. Another limitation was the dispersion of the evidence itself. The incidents did not occur in a single location, nor were the outcomes concentrated in one place. The bodies were found in different areas, at different times, often without immediate context linking them together. This dispersion made it difficult to establish continuity. Each piece of evidence had to be interpreted not only on its own, but in relation to others that were separated by time and space. Building a coherent narrative from such dispersed elements is inherently challenging, and it increases the likelihood that some connections will remain uncertain. The suspected involvement of multiple individuals introduced an additional layer of complexity. In cases involving a single offender, establishing responsibility, while still difficult, follows a more direct path. In cases involving a group, that path becomes more complicated. It requires determining not only whether individuals were involved, but how they were involved. What roles did they play? Were they present at specific moments? Did they act together, or separately within a broader framework? These questions are critical for legal proceedings, but they are also among the most difficult to answer without clear, direct evidence. As a result, the investigation reached a point where it could suggest a broader reality, without being able to fully prove it. This distinction is essential. Suggestion, even when strongly supported by patterns and circumstantial evidence, is not enough to establish complete accountability within a legal framework. It can guide investigation, inform understanding, and shape public perception, but it cannot replace the need for proof. This is why the outcomes of the case were, as previously described, partial. Some individuals were identified and prosecuted based on evidence that met the required standard. Their involvement was established to the extent that the available information allowed. But beyond those specific instances, the broader structure of the case remained only partially defined. The limits of evidence also influenced how the case was ultimately interpreted. Without a complete set of provable facts, there is space for multiple interpretations, some grounded in available data, others extending beyond it. This creates a tension between what is known and what is believed. Investigators must operate within the boundaries of what can be proven, while the public may consider possibilities that extend beyond those boundaries. In this case, that tension remains. It is not resolved, because it cannot be resolved without new evidence. Over time, the absence of additional evidence becomes a defining feature in itself. It establishes a boundary around the case, a point beyond which understanding cannot currently extend. This boundary does not diminish the importance of what has been uncovered, but it does clarify its limits. It shows that even with sustained investigation, even with careful analysis and comparison, there are situations where not every aspect can be brought into full clarity. Ultimately, the limits of evidence do not represent a failure of the investigative process. They represent the conditions under which that process operates. Evidence is shaped by time, by circumstance, by what is left behind and what is not. And in this case, what was left behind was enough to reveal a pattern, to identify certain individuals, and to establish that the crimes were real and connected. But it was not enough to fully define every element of what occurred. And that distinction, between what could be proven and what could only be inferred, remains central to understanding the case as a whole. How the case endures over time. As the years passed after the events surrounding the family murders, the case did not fade into obscurity in the way many resolved investigations eventually do. Instead, it remained present, less visible in daily discourse, but firmly embedded in the collective memory of South Australia. Its persistence is not driven by constant new developments or discoveries, but by the nature of what it represents, a case that was partially understood, partially resolved, and yet never fully closed. Memory, in this context, does not function as a simple record of past events. It evolves. It is shaped by what is known, what is believed, and what remains uncertain. In the absence of a complete narrative, the memory of the case becomes layered. There are the confirmed facts, the victims, the timeline, the outcomes of specific legal proceedings. There are also the unresolved elements, the suspected involvement of additional individuals, the possibility of further victims, the gaps in the sequence of events. Together, these layers form a memory that is not fixed, but dynamic. Each time the case is revisited, whether in discussions, analyses, or reflections, those layers are re-examined. The confirmed elements remain stable, but the unresolved aspects invite interpretation. This is why the case continues to be discussed long after the primary investigations have ended. It offers not just answers, but questions. And questions, particularly those without definitive resolution, tend to endure. The legacy of the case also extends into how communities understand vulnerability and visibility. The fact that the victims were young and, in many cases, socially isolated has become a central point of reflection. It has influenced how absence is perceived, how quickly concern is raised, how seriously early signs are taken, and how patterns are identified across seemingly unrelated events. While no single case can redefine an entire system, it can contribute to a shift in awareness. In this instance, that shift involves recognizing that individuals who exist on the margins of social networks may require greater attention, not less. Another aspect of the case's legacy lies in its impact on investigative thinking. It has become an example of how complex patterns can exist without immediate recognition, and how the process of identifying those patterns requires both time and a willingness to reconsider earlier assumptions. The case demonstrates that investigations are not static. They evolve as new information emerges, as perspectives change, and as connections that were previously overlooked come into focus. This lesson extends beyond the specific events of the case. It applies to the broader practice of investigation, emphasizing the importance of flexibility, persistence, and comparative analysis. At the same time, the case serves as a reminder of the limits of those efforts. Even with sustained attention, even with the application of evolving methodologies, there are situations where not every question can be answered. This recognition is part of the case's legacy as well. It tempers expectations, reinforcing the understanding that some level of uncertainty may remain, regardless of how much time passes. Public perception of the case has also been shaped by its unresolved elements. Unlike cases that conclude with a clear narrative, where responsibility is fully established and the sequence of events is comprehensively documented, this case resists simplification. It cannot be easily summarized without acknowledging what is missing. This complexity influences how it is remembered. It is not recalled as a single, contained story, but as a series of interconnected issues: crime, investigation, limitation, and uncertainty. For those directly affected, the families of the victims, the legacy is more personal and more immediate. While the broader public may engage with the case as a subject of analysis or reflection, for them it represents loss that is not fully contextualized. The absence of a complete explanation means that certain questions remain unanswered on a deeply personal level. This aspect of the case does not change over time. It persists, independent of broader interpretations or societal lessons. In this way, the legacy of the case exists on multiple levels. There is the institutional level, where it informs investigative practices and legal considerations. There is the societal level, where it influences perceptions of safety, vulnerability, and awareness. And there is the personal level, where it remains tied to individual experiences of loss and uncertainty. These levels do not always align perfectly, but together they define how the case continues to exist in the present. Ultimately, what allows the case to endure is not just what happened, but what could not be fully explained. The combination of established facts and unresolved questions creates a structure that resists closure. It ensures that the case remains relevant, not as an active investigation, but as an ongoing point of reference. A reminder that some events do not conclude in a definitive way, and that their impact extends beyond the moment in which they occurred. In that sense, the case is not only part of the past. It continues to shape how the present understands the past, and how it prepares for the possibility that not everything can be fully known. The silence between what is known and what is not in the end, the story of the family murders does not conclude with a single, definitive statement. It does not resolve into a complete narrative where every question has an answer and every action has been fully accounted for. Instead, it settles into something quieter, more complex, a space defined as much by what is known as by what remains beyond reach. In South Australia, the case stands as a reminder that not all events can be fully reconstructed, even when significant effort has been made to understand them. There is a natural expectation that time will bring clarity. That as years pass, as investigations continue, as information is revisited, the remaining gaps will gradually close. And in many cases, that expectation is met. Details emerge. Connections are confirmed. Narratives become more complete. But this case does not follow that pattern. Here, time has not eliminated uncertainty. It has, in some ways, defined it. The silence that exists within the case, the absence of complete answers, is not empty. It is structured. It exists between confirmed facts, between established events, between the points where understanding begins and where it must stop. This silence is not the result of inattention or neglect. It is the result of limits. Limits in evidence. Limits in visibility. Limits in what could be preserved, discovered, and ultimately proven. And those limits shape the final form of the case. What remains, then, is not a singular story, but a layered one. At its core are the victims, at least 5 young individuals whose lives ended under circumstances that were not fully explained. Their presence anchors the case in reality, in loss, in the undeniable fact that something occurred that cannot be undone. Around that core are the elements that have been established, the pattern of targeting, the structure of the crimes, the involvement of multiple individuals, and the legal outcomes that addressed parts of that structure. These elements form the framework of what is known. But surrounding that framework are the unanswered questions. Questions about the full extent of the group. Questions about the precise roles of those involved. Questions about whether the known victims represent the entirety of the case, or only a portion of it. These questions do not exist at the edges. They are interwoven with the known elements, shaping how those elements are understood. They prevent the case from becoming static. They keep it open, not in an investigative sense, but in an interpretive one. There is a tendency, when confronted with unresolved cases, to seek closure through speculation. To fill the gaps with assumptions, to construct narratives that extend beyond the available evidence. But doing so risks distorting what is already difficult to understand. In this case, the absence of complete answers is not an invitation to create new ones without foundation. It is a reminder of the importance of restraint, of recognizing where knowledge ends and where uncertainty begins. This distinction is not always comfortable. It leaves space where resolution is expected. It requires acceptance that some aspects of the case may remain undefined, not because they are unimportant, but because they are inaccessible. Yet within that discomfort, there is also clarity. A clarity about the nature of truth in complex situations. That it is not always complete. That it can exist in fragments. That it can be partially known, partially proven, and partially beyond reach. The legacy of this case, therefore, is not only in what it reveals, but in what it cannot fully reveal. It challenges assumptions about how stories end, about how justice is defined, and about how understanding is constructed. It shows that there are moments where the pursuit of answers reaches its limit, not because the questions are no longer valid, but because the means to answer them are no longer available. And so the case remains. Not active, not unresolved in the procedural sense, but incomplete in a deeper way. It exists as a record of events that were partially uncovered, partially explained, and never entirely contained within a single narrative. It exists as a reflection of both the capacity and the limitation of investigation, of memory and of interpretation. In the space between what is known and what is not, there is no final conclusion. Only acknowledgement. Acknowledgement of the victims. Acknowledgement of the efforts made to understand what happened. An acknowledgement that, in some cases, the story does not end with certainty, but with the enduring presence of questions that may never be fully answered. Listening to what cannot be heard, there is a point, in cases like the family murders, where the narrative no longer advances through new discoveries, new evidence, or new conclusions. Instead, it reaches a quieter stage, one where the absence of information becomes as significant as its presence. In South Australia, this case has settled into that space. Not forgotten, not resolved in the fullest sense, but existing in a state where what remains unsaid carries as much weight as what has been established. To understand this final stage is not to search for new answers, but to recognize the boundaries of those that already exist. The facts, as they stand, form a structure, at least 5 victims, a pattern of targeted individuals, indications of coordination, and partial legal accountability. These elements define the case. They provide clarity where clarity is possible. But beyond them lies something less defined, a silence that cannot be filled with certainty. This silence is not passive. It shapes interpretation. It influences how the case is remembered, how it is discussed, and how it continues to resonate over time. It is present in the unanswered questions about the full extent of those involved, about the possibility of additional victims, about the exact sequence of events that cannot be reconstructed in full detail. These are not minor gaps. They are central to the nature of the case. And yet, they do not diminish the importance of what is known. Instead, they exist alongside it, creating a dual reality, one that is grounded in evidence, and one that remains beyond it. There is a temptation, particularly with cases that resist closure, to push beyond this boundary, to interpret the unknown as if it was simply undiscovered rather than potentially unknowable. But this case resists that approach. It does not offer enough to support a complete reconstruction, and it does not allow for speculation without risking distortion. What it requires instead is a different kind of attention. Not the attention that seeks to resolve, but the attention that seeks to understand the limits of resolution itself. In that sense, the case becomes less about finding an ending and more about recognizing what it means for a story not to have one. Not in the traditional sense. Because there is an ending, of course. The events stopped. The investigations concluded as far as they could. Legal outcomes were reached where evidence allowed. But the narrative, the full, coherent account that explains everything, does not exist. And perhaps never will. This realization does not reduce the case. It reframes it. It shifts the focus from completion to comprehension. From final answers to enduring questions. It invites a form of engagement that is quieter, more reflective, and more aware of its own limitations. For those who revisit the case, who study it, who attempt to understand it, this becomes the final task, not to solve what remains unsolved, but to listen to what cannot be fully articulated. To recognize the presence of absence. To understand that some aspects of reality, particularly those shaped by time, fragmentation, and incomplete evidence, do not resolve into clear narratives. They remain as they are, partial, complex, and open. And in that openness, there is a kind of truth. Not a complete one, not a definitive one, but a truthful acknowledgement of what is known and what is not. A recognition that both are part of the same story. As this account comes to a close, there is no final revelation to offer. No hidden detail that changes everything. Only the structure that has been outlined, a series of events, a pattern identified, a response that was real but limited, and a set of questions that remain. This is the case as it exists. Not simplified, not resolved beyond what evidence allows, but presented as it is, both complete in its facts and incomplete in its totality. And perhaps that is the final point to consider. That understanding does not always come from having all the answers. Sometimes, it comes from recognizing why those answers cannot be fully obtained, and what that absence reveals about the nature of truth itself. A story without a final line. There are cases that end with a verdict, cases that close with a confession, and cases that resolve into a single, coherent narrative that leaves little room for doubt. But the family murders does not belong to that category. In South Australia, it remains something else entirely, a case that reached conclusions, but not a conclusion. A story that was investigated, prosecuted in part, and remembered, yet never fully completed. What defines this case, in the end, is not just what happened, but what could not be fully assembled into a single, definitive account. The structure exists, multiple victims, a repeated pattern, the strong indication of coordinated actions, and legal outcomes that confirmed aspects of that structure. These elements are real. They are established. They form the foundation of everything that is understood about the case. But a foundation is not the same as a finished structure. There are spaces within it, gaps that were never filled, connections that were never fully drawn, identities that were never completely confirmed. These spaces do not disappear with time. They remain, shaping the way the case is perceived long after the active investigation has ended. In many ways, this is what gives the case its enduring presence. It does not settle into the past as something fully defined. Instead, it continues to exist at the edge of understanding, where certainty and uncertainty meet. Each time it is revisited, the same duality appears. What is known stands clearly, while what is unknown resists clarification. This tension is not resolved, because it cannot be resolved without new evidence, and none has emerged to change the fundamental structure of the case. There is also a broader implication to this kind of unresolved narrative. It challenges the expectation that every event can be fully understood if enough time and effort are applied. It suggests that there are limits, not just practical limits, but inherent ones. Limits shaped by what was recorded, what was lost, what was never observed, and what cannot be reconstructed after the fact. These limits are not unique to this case, but here, they are particularly visible. They define the boundaries of knowledge, marking the point beyond which certainty cannot extend. For the community, for investigators, and for those who continue to reflect on the case, this creates a lasting impression. Not one of confusion, but of incompleteness. A recognition that something significant occurred, that parts of it were uncovered and addressed, but that the entirety of it remains just out of reach. This is not an easy conclusion to accept. It leaves open the possibility of additional truths that may never be known. It leaves questions that do not have answers, and perhaps never will. And yet, within that incompleteness, there is still meaning. The case has contributed to a broader understanding of how patterns can form and remain hidden, how vulnerability can intersect with opportunity, and how investigation, even when thorough, operates within limits. It has influenced awareness, shaped perception, and become a reference point for how complex cases are approached and understood. These are not small outcomes. They represent a form of impact that extends beyond resolution. In the end, this epilogue is not a conclusion in the traditional sense. It does not tie together every thread, or provide a final perspective that resolves all ambiguity. Instead, it acknowledges the structure as it stands, a case partially illuminated, partially obscured, and permanently situated between the two. It is a reminder that some stories do not end with clarity, but with recognition of what has been uncovered, and of what remains beyond reach. And perhaps that is where this story ultimately rests. Not in a final line that closes the narrative, but in an understanding that the narrative itself remains open. Not active, not unresolved in a procedural sense, but incomplete in a way that cannot be fully changed. A story without a final line, only the quiet persistence of everything that has been found, and everything that has not.